Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's a really exciting day today. And Jason teed it up well because we have a lot of ground to cover. There's a simple word that really summarizes all of our different areas of risk here that are different and complementary, and that is mayhem. Mayhem, right? How many of you have seen the Allstate commercial with Dean Winters, I think, is the guy? And that's a story about a mythical guy who just does really bad things. Well, in this cyber world, we have real bad actors out there doing terrible things every day, and it affects everyone in this room and all of us here in different ways, and we all are trying to address that mayhem, hopefully before it happens. We'd like to talk about the ways we do that in our respective spheres. And we call it war stories. What war stories, real ones, real world experiences have we dealt with that we could hopefully convey? I know you've all dealt with it too, and a lot of this hopefully will resonate with you. Now, what are a few tangible tips that we can offer based on our respective experiences dealing with this mayhem, this cyber mayhem? So why don't we have our panelists introduce themselves? We'll start with Michelle. Tell us about yourself, what you do.
Thank you. Michelle Falo. I'm with Lockton, one of the insurance brokers out there. I actually just joined the company about a year and a half ago. I came from AIG, where I was running the North America practice on the underwriting side. So I'm an underwriting broker now. I'm told quite often throughout my day that I sound like an underwriter and I need to broke more, but my focus is just on really providing transparency and education for our clients, right? Let them know what's going on, let them tap into our network. Our network is you folks in the room, this panel, to learn. You can never learn enough, and it's almost impossible to stay ahead of the curve with what's going on out there in the threat environment. We focus obviously a lot on cyber, but we do a lot on E&O. So a little bit of what I'm going to talk today about too is how those two worlds are colliding and some things that you need to think about in that space when it comes to underwriting the policies, when it comes to just the language that you're seeking, the partners that you're working with, and so forth, because there's a lot going on out there in cyber. But remember, cyber was actually born out of E&O, so the two are very much intertwined.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle. Excited that you're here with us today. Kevin, tell us about you.
Hi, I'm Kevin Kehoe. I'm the president of DataWise Networks. We're a business, technology, and security consulting firm, and we're a managed services and security provider. Sometimes there's some conflict of interest in there, so we have partners that we work with depending on compliance and legal requirements, and it kind of showcases that we need each other to actually be able to defend our clients in this threat landscape. I've been in the industry in IT for about 25 years, and I've done a lot of different roles, from end user to support to network engineering and server projects and management. I've actually done a lot of disaster recovery and cyber. I did like computer forensics, really to get better at the disaster recovery part, not necessarily so much to fight in this battle, but that's how I learned about this. And then now I just develop teams. I've developed a lot of teams, IT teams in-house. I've actually developed teams for a couple of MSPs. There's actually my DataWise Networks is my third MSP and my second MSSP. So I've been around the block a little bit with that.
Awesome. That's great, Kevin. In fact, Kevin and our next guest here, Chuck, team up together. They are our technologists on the panel today. Chuck, tell us what you do.
My name is Chuck Sedlacek. I'm with DataWise Networks. I'm the vice president. This is my fourth MSP company I've started. I've worked with the FBI, NSA, CIA, Ukrainian government, Japanese corporations. So I've seen a lot around the world as far as the threat landscape and what providers and clients have to deal with in this climate currently. Kevin and I work together. I currently do business development, marketing. Have taken that role and kind of got out of the technical side, but have to keep up on it, obviously. So I'm out there talking with the clients, feeling their pains with them.
Great. Thank you for being here. And Bruce is our cyber insurance coverage specialist who works a lot in this area. Bruce, tell the audience what you do.
Hi, Bruce DeMedici. I'm an attorney. I also do consulting with small, medium enterprises.
Here you go.
small medium enterprises on the risk landscape associated with cyber insurance coverage, not from the technological standpoint, but from the standpoint of making sure that they have appropriate coverage, understand the risk landscape, and be able to make good decisions for these folks to my right to make sure that they're covered and preserve enterprise value.
Awesome. Thank you all. I'm Hillard Sterling, by the way. I'm with the law firm Retzel and Andrus, and I do technology and cyber law. So I defend breach victims. I defend companies in privacy cases. So they're not victimized twice, especially these poor breach victims, first by the hackers and then by the plaintiffs' lawyers, circling like vultures, trying to make money off of the misfortune of these companies. So why don't we move to Michelle and start off with a war story about the collision between cyber and E&O, as you referenced.
Yeah. So many of our clients are very focused on buying cyber coverage. But what we're really focused on as well is making sure we understand their entire business, professional services that they could be providing, and so forth. And I mentioned before that cyber was born out of E&O. And really what's happening in the marketplace right now is E&O has such a long history. And there was maybe some gray areas in coverage with E&O when it came to privacy, because if there was a privacy issue or a data breach, did it arise out of professional services? The E&O side of the house, the E&O type coverage was broad. It didn't necessarily have all these exclusions. Well, now as the cyber side of the house, you've seen the last couple years everything going on with ransomware, data breaches, exfiltration of information, a lot of stuff, and uptick of activity in the regulatory environment. The E&O policies are starting to have cyber exclusions. And so what we've seen a lot of our clients do is combine those policies. We've seen the cyber and the E&O packaged together with a single carrier to avoid some of the conflict, right? Is it covered? It doesn't matter what coverage section. I want my policy. I want that contract certainty. We have actually, I could speak to 3 instances. Unfortunately, there's a new one that just popped up where we worked with a new client for us, and they had insufficient E&O type coverage, and there was a difference in retentions on the policy as well. And so the client had a data breach going on. There was somebody that had infiltrated their system, and they were in there for about 8 months. And at the same time, they also had negligence in their professional services, something they were doing on the miscellaneous side, and it filtered into what they were providing through their technology services. So they had an extremely large incident, very sensitive issue. It actually led to bodily injury and property damage as well. So we had E&O activity going on, we had confidential information, we had bodily injury, and there was different retentions. There was different terms and conditions in each of the policies. Some of the policies didn't even know they were going to be triggered. And unfortunately, this client had spent millions trying to just get organized around what policies they thought would respond, trying to manage the communication and the public relations piece of it, trying to protect themselves from things going on in the future. And they struggled because they had, on the E&O and cyber side specifically, they had different retentions. And so there was a lot of money spent on trying to get carriers and other parties that were involved in this claim to understand, was this arising out of their E&O, or was it a security issue? Was it a data breach type issue? Then there was a lot of chatter about privacy. Privacy overlaps a lot, and privacy events, privacy issues can overlap a lot with what arises out of your E&O. And so there was a lot of money spent working to understand what side of the fence this should fall on, what type of retention should apply. There was not the best language in the policy, and it was a bit of a struggle. And then to add more to it, the GL policy was triggered because of that bodily injury piece. And then the client had to take steps back to educate those carriers, on that tower and so forth. So the client not only had to pay well into the millions. I would say right now, based on the math that I know of as of today, it's over 30 million. And that's combined partially with a lot of the money and the time that they've had to spend just to kind of untangle things. And so, I would say a big lesson here is when you're looking at your cyber exposure, one, understand other policies that can respond to these types of incidents, and two, making sure you're working with carriers and brokers and any of the third parties, law firms, coverage attorneys, scary attorneys, that can help provide that contract certainty. You shouldn't be figuring that out at the time that you have an incident, right? That's time, that's money. And this incident also impacted other third parties that they had contracts with, entities that were relying on them for their services. So there was just so much commotion and so much stress going on. And at the same time, the CISO had resigned in the middle of all this. So now the person that you're trying to go back to get information, right, to do some digging and put the puzzle pieces together is no longer there. So it just was another layer of added stress. So it took about 2.5 years to fully untangle, and there's still loose ends that exist today.
It doesn't sound like that resignation was entirely coincidental. Now,
I don't know.
Michelle, how should the insurance industry move to avoid these collisions between all these different coverage pieces?
Yeah, I mean, it's really understanding. I mean, unfortunately, as a cyber or an E&O broker, I'd say you have to really spend some time understanding property and casualty policies, D&O policies, crime, employment practices, because you really have to understand where the coverage is. And clients rely so much on other parties to educate them on what their exposure is. And again, that contract certainty. How are you managing the expectations of the board? They want to know, do we have insurance for this? That's typically one of the first calls that happens. The risk manager or whatnot gets a phone call that says, are we covered for this? I don't know. There's 15 things going on right now. But to really lay out that work and to understand where there's overlap, where you can work with third parties to provide that contract certainty, where you could really partner with really good carriers that also have experience in this space adjusting claims. You want a carrier that can navigate a really complicated environment. Really, honestly, that's not dealing with it for the first time, right? You don't want to deal with the first-time rookie when you have a complicated multi-million-dollar issue like that. So that would be my advice out the gate.
Excellent, thank you. So do you think in the future that the evolution of the industry is going to be such that we can avoid those types of collisions? Are the policies going to get more clear on what covers a cyber event like that?
I'm going to look out of the corner of my eye down here to my left too, but I have a lot of faith that it will, right? Because part of this is cyber is still not a very mature product. I mean, a couple decades does not make this a mature product at all. And the ransom environment came crashing down, right? And the sky was falling, and we learned a lot. But we have so much more to learn. And I would say with privacy, the uptick in litigation on the privacy side, it's a blessing and a curse, right? Because now you're learning more. You're learning about factual and real-time situations, how to navigate those, who the parties are and the third parties that you can work with to help navigate those and understand. And I think it will get to better language and policies, more contract certainty, and it's all going to benefit the client. If it goes the other way, then there's going to be no market, and we're not going to have an InTouch live session because we won't be selling cyber. Nobody wants cyber to go away. We need it, but we have to find balance in what the actual policy is going to look like. But I have a lot of faith that the terms will get better over time.
Hope you're right. By the way, if there are any questions, don't hesitate to raise your hand. We're hoping that this is more interactive than just us talking. So feel free at any point in time to raise your hand, and if I'm not looking, say something. I'll get you. Okay, great. Well, let's move to another set of war stories in the technological space with Kevin and Chuck are in the technological trenches of dealing with cyber events, both pre and post-breach. So let's hear about a war story. It probably resonates with a lot of us that we've seen out there. What happened and how did you fix it?
So how many people know somebody or a company or have experienced a data breach, either data theft or destruction of data like a ransom attack? Cool. Well, I'm glad to not see everybody's hands raised up. But yeah, I think a lot of people have had these experiences. So I want to contrast a couple of different scenarios. The first scenario is it's a technology manufacturing company that took several years of investment and was delayed in producing their product line. They experienced a data breach where data had been stolen, actually intellectual property had been stolen, and they received an email and claiming this theft and to threatening to sell the data on the open market unless they paid the ransom. So the company had to get forensics involved, and as the forensics team got involved, they found that there was really no log data. There was a one-man IT department to support 350 machines. The IT manager had retired, I think, the previous year. There was really a lack of ability to communicate and collaborate. The forensics teams and the additional third-party teams, which we were the third-party teams that came in to remediate and restore. There was an email breach. Basically, we had to really rebuild the email services into Microsoft 365. They had a 14-year-old email server version running. It was multiple versions out of date, and that's how the breach occurred. They ultimately experienced over $100,000 of costs within about a month and a half about a month and a half period, and that was by the time we finished and disengaged. But that's legal counsel, that's forensics teams, that's additional personnel for collecting logs and helping with forensics, and the emergency migration of 175 users and a full forklift of Microsoft Office at full upgrade across 175 machines. So because of the lack of log data, the lack of ability to communicate, it created a lot of pain and suffering. It created a lot of delays. Like what could have been done in probably a third of the time was just bloated and extended. And ultimately, most of the damages were due to just not enough IT resources and a lack of IT management, and really no best practices being observed at all. Another scenario is a client that we have that we were a few months into the managing their contract. We had done some NIST-based vulnerability assessments. We had a plan of attack. We had a poem. We had a series of projects we needed to roll out for the client. We understood their budget. We kind of timelined things out. We were about 60% of the way through rolling out these different remediations. Luckily, we had a lot of the core foundational pieces in place, at least around all of the critical infrastructure. And we actually, they had remote desktop open and exposed out to the internet, which is a really bad idea. So we were working on remediating that, and we were a few weeks away from actually deploying the product out to the clients when July 4th weekend, not this last July 4th, but before, came around, and one of their patient zero was traveling internationally, and they, instead of using the product they should have been using, they used the remote desktop. There was a breach. They got in on a Thursday, like late Thursday, and then by Saturday, like late Friday night, Saturday morning, they were trying to breach the data servers. Because we already understood the threat landscape, we already understood our vulnerabilities, we were already planning, we were 60% of the way through deploying all of this, we understood where there was going to be attacks, and we were on guard. It was a holiday weekend. Threat actors love to work on the holidays, so we like to slumber and have fun, and so our guard is down. But we actually ended up, our systems were running. Our network operations center received an alert that a critical server was down. I logged in, and lo and behold, there's somebody brute forcing, trying to decrypt passwords, and they're trying to encrypt data, trying to access remote systems over the network. So I immediately grab as much screenshots as I can, and I email our security operations center. Well, unbeknownst to me at that moment, because I was in panic mode and shutting things down, they ended up calling me and said, "Hey, we've got telemetry on one of your servers that there's something malicious going on." And I said, "Well, that's great. Go check this email I sent you." And so after forensics analysis, they were in the server at 11:30 p.m. on Friday. I got a server down late, like around somewhere before midnight. I didn't actually check my phone until bedtime. It was closer to 1. And so within an hour and a half, we knew something was going on. We were shutting everything down, and we were starting our disaster recovery and business continuity plans. We had talked to our security operations center. They had already fed back a bunch of information to me about potential systems. We knew our vulnerabilities, so I told them what was going on, and they confirmed a few machines that we needed to look at. So next morning, I let our CFO for our client sleep until 9 o'clock the next day, or Saturday morning. Not the next day, it was just 9 o'clock that morning. And inform them what was going on, what we were doing, and just kind of let them know what the remediation practices were based on our business continuity planning and our risk management outline. And they were surprisingly calm. They actually, I've been in a lot of these situations, especially being called in to do incident response, and it's usually a panic nightmare. It's grueling. The executives are all, stressed out. Everybody's just having a hard time. But this CFO was she was really, happy that we were in action and we were taking care of stuff and letting them know.
Because she got to sleep and.
Well, yeah, she got to sleep. Yeah.
The one behind the scenes. Well, talk about how you mentioned the word best practices, and that really stuck out. And maybe Chuck could speak to this as well. How do you avoid that problem in the first place, especially when you drive talking about the situation where you have one IT person? How could these companies do a better job of implementing best practices to avoid that kind of a nightmare?
Well, I mean, don't do critical business on old systems. That's probably once systems get old enough, they're not supported anymore. I'm sure you've probably all heard that by now a million times, but that's really important. Also, evaluating your risks based on standards that have been identified by NIST, by the insurance companies, which I'm sure many of you are, very familiar with that. And also, looking at your legal. So if it's federal, state compliances, or your legal contract, your contractual compliances, understanding what you're required to protect, and then looking at your technology and making sure it's aligned. Ultimately, though, you're asking, well, how do we create the budget for that, right? I mean, that's kind of the hard part. Technology is always moving forward in a way that it's getting cheaper to do the same things. So if you haven't refreshed your technology stack for a while and haven't looked at your budget, you may be able to, make it more efficient, and then take some of those dollars and start putting them towards some of your security initiatives.
That's awesome, Chuck. Yeah, build on that, please.
Yeah, the threat landscape's getting very complicated. The threat actors are getting more creative. And so we need to evolve as far as the technology providers, the consultants, the insurance companies, the IT departments. We need to get more creative and more complex in the way that we're approaching this problem. And it's no longer like back in the day when we were more concerned about what kind of threats are coming through our firewalls and getting to our endpoints. That's less of a concern. Because we know they're eventually going to come through. There's no solution that can stop all this stuff. There's no IT company, cybersecurity consultants that can say, you're protected. That's not the case anymore. You're going to most likely get breached, get hacked at some point, whether it be through a social engineering exercise that you get involved in and they're trying to get you to wire money, via an email conversation that's coming from the CEO. I had that happen. You have to get more sophisticated in the way that you're approaching this. So it's really important to get to build that team. I really advise people to get a third-party consultant that can kind of holistically knows the threat landscape, can look at a business from the top down. How the receptionist answers the phone and replies to emails, all the way to how the CEO communicates with the CFO and the IT department and so on. It's all about secure processes, and creating policies and procedures for everything. Because after you get past all the technical protections, you got to think about the business workflows and all the minutia that goes on there, because there's things that happen in those transactions all the time that causes all kinds of horrific things to, happen coming from the cyber world. Kevin mentioned before, working with a team, developing that, taking the time to sit down and go, okay, I've got a technical team that's making sure we're following the standards, we're patching and updating our systems, okay, got that covered. We've got an attorney we can call for breach coaching in case something happens. We've got our insurance broker that can help us, guide us through, what insurance we need to protect ourselves. We have, whether it's the IT department working with an outside cybersecurity firm or security operations center, we've got that. They specialize in that, and the two can work with each other, for prevention and remediation in case something happens. And maybe even having a CIO, CTO, or a consultant that's overseeing all of it. Are we compliant? Are we following regulations? Have you guys done your job? Have you done your job? What are our costs? So on and so forth. So as you can see, there's many components now. This isn't just a simple solution, and small businesses are having a hard time with this. And so what our job is to come in and be that CIO, CISO, CTO, and help guide them of what they're going to need, every little moving part, and overseeing all of that.
Those are excellent points, and the theme there is being proactive, right? Is getting a hold of the problem, finding out what the problem is first, because you don't know what it is. You can't address it until you know what it
And
is.
it's not just willy-nilly proactivity, but it's to a standard. I mean, the one thing that's been being developed is there's been practices, going back to 2014, that the NIST outlined for managed service providers to create a secure infrastructure. I think it's been revised, but there's a lot of guidance out there that's been around for a while. We need to tap into it.
I'd say that it's not one and done either. Sometimes people think, well, we did it when? 4.5 years ago. Ugh. Like, you got to stay on top of this, right? Think about personnel coming in and out. You're expanding your teams. The company footprint can change. You have to go back and put checks and balance. I like what you say, having the overarching person, kind of making sure everyone's doing their jobs and things too. And, when it comes to technology, some of you in the room might say, well, we have old technology. What are we going to do? We have old assets, old things. You can ring fence that, right? If you're talking to the right people, there's ways that you can ring fence some of this as you start to retire it, right? And bring in new hardware, new technology. So it's not like you could just have to rip everything out and plug all the new, latest, greatest stuff in. There's ways that you can create steps, right, to get to a better place. And there's a ton of help. I agree. There's a ton of help along the way with that stuff.
Spot on. And one thing piece of mayhem in the litigation world that I always am concerned about, all this great work that you do to make sure that clients are preparing themselves pre-breach and doing it frequently or certainly periodically at least, you're all creating exhibits for prospective adversaries. This is all discoverable information unless you've structured it properly, so it could be protected under the attorney-client communication privilege. So counsel needs to be involved in that process to quarterback it, just like counsel needs a quarterback or coach after a breach. It's even more important because you're creating evidence. And when those plaintiffs' lawyers get a hold of all those emails and texts and all the log reports and risk assessments, they're not looking for truth, they're looking for money.
Is that as simple as just CCing the legal counsel, or?
No, and that's a lot of people think, oh, I'll just CC my lawyer on that. Courts are not that generous when they get a privilege log. So you need to do it much more carefully and deliberately, talk with your lawyers to make sure it's being done properly. Well, let's go into the coverage area. And the war nation-state exclusion has gotten headlines recently in various ways, and you can categorize that as mayhem for certain companies out there. And this gentleman knows all about it. Bruce, tell us about the war nation-state exclusion. What's going out there that's tough and that's causing these problems, and how can we fix them?
So this is the part of the conversation I like because it involves making fun of lawyers and geopolitical considerations. So the war and nation state exclusion arose from the backdrop of 9/11 and NotPetya and the like, where carriers began to be concerned that their underwriting was not going to line up with the extent of risk. And so Lloyd's got in front of this. Lloyd's reinsures so many people that effectively all the large policies involve Lloyd's. Lloyd's got in front of this, and they started mandating that policies where Lloyd's was involved, syndicate, broker, or the like, needed to have one of particular clauses in the policy. There were 4 clauses, and without going through them, 3 of them either limited or excluded coverage. And there's very specific language and definitions. And to give you a sense of how widespread this can be, the war and nation state exclusion applies if, inter alia, it's a cyber event. What's a cyber event? A cyber event is a basically use of a computer system to degrade, destroy information of another computer system by or on behalf of a nation state. Now, please tell me that that's a narrow definition. What isn't covered by that? So let's talk about what it means to be by or on behalf of a nation state, and this is where it gets fun. There are 2 terms I'm going to familiarize you with. First is cyber buccaneers. We think back to our history lessons when European countries would hire pirates to commission to rob ships of other countries. They were buccaneers. Today we have cyber buccaneers. Contemporary nation states are hiring cyber attack firms to act on behalf of the nation states. We have cyber militia, attack firms that have not been formally hired by nation states, but have self-aligned with nation states. So the geopolitical landscape is normalizing the use of cyber in warfare settings. That's in place. Arguably, it's already normalized. It's not going away. It's only going to expand. So every time we read or we see in CNN or the like that some activity, some cyber attack has occurred in either an existing war theater, such as Russia or Ukraine, or as a case of Estonia and Lithuania getting shut down, somebody who's acting in a proactive nature, that's all potentially going to be included within the concept of what is a war and nation state exclusion from coverage. And in terms of adequacy of explanation on that, from Lloyd's standpoint, if, for example, the U.S. State Department attributes a cyber attack to a nation state, then Lloyd's takes the position that their burden of proof is satisfied, which puts a small and medium enterprise in a position of having to challenge the exclusion. Let's talk about that from a practical nature, and I hope I don't hurt the feelings of any lawyers in this crowd. So suppose, for sake of discussion, it's a $3 million loss. So you call the lawyer and you say, this has been excluded, I want to challenge it. I'm going to put Hillard on the spot. I've just called you with a $3 million loss. What's your legal budget to fight Zurich and Lloyd's all the way through final non-appealable judgment?
That's privileged information. I can't disclose that.
Which means he's going to charge you north of $2 million on the $3 million loss. Now, also, Hiller's going to tell you that you need to employ 1 or 2 outside cybersecurity forensic firms because you're fighting the attribution and you need to be able to persuade the court that it was not an act of a nation state. So now we've got a budget that's probably going to approach the amount of the loss with no certainty of result. The judicial landscape is largely virgin. There are 2 cases that people might talk to you about. Merck and Mondelez said, yeah, that's all been resolved. No, it has not been resolved. Mondelez settled, so we don't know what happened. Merck, recently the state appellate court ruled that the carriers had to pay, but that was because the event occurred under a general property casualty policy, and basically the court said that the parties didn't contemplate the cyber risk landscape when they signed the policy, so it's not fair to the insured, which I personally think was a good decision. But today, the policies that are going to be called into question will have contemplated the cyber risk landscape. So it's largely a virgin landscape. So the first folks that have to go litigate this, again, are going to be fighting very rich and powerful interests that cannot afford to have a precedent. All of which circles back to what you've already heard. Insureds need to understand what their policy is all about and to put best practices in place, because the best solution for what I've been talking about is what you've already heard, that best practices in place. If there is litigation, if there's a close call, that by my standpoint, the best defense to present to a court as to why the court should require the carrier to pay is that the insured had best practices in place and it did everything that it could.
Isn't there an opportunity also to make the policy exclusion more clear? Because right now, in a bunch of these policies, it just says war and nation state. Why not put some more detail in there so you can head off some of these issues?
Glad you asked me the question. We're talking bargaining leverage. The optimal bargaining leverage, when you're sitting down with Lockton, the optimal bargaining leverage is to show Lockton that you have cyber hygiene in place and you've had it in place for a while. And you have logs. You have logs. I cannot overstate that. You have logs to show you've had it in place for a while and that you've tested it and you've made fixes. You've constantly worked on it as a dynamic project, just like an NFL playbook. Just because the NFL playbook worked last week doesn't mean you're going to win with the identical playbook this week. You're probably going to lose if you don't change it. So if you can show Lockton that you have hygiene in place and you're making an earnest effort, you can seek to negotiate softer language in the exclusion, maybe allowance of a particular amount. Now, here's a related point that all you're going to have fun with this as well. Of course, this has given rise to debates in Washington, D.C. to have a national cyber insurance backdrop, which comes out of all your checks, your paychecks for more taxes, just in case you didn't figure that one out. And so there's obviously going to be a controversy there, but from my vista, the next time we have a large attack, it's going to accelerate the discussion about whether there should be a national cyber insurance policy. So the backdrop of this is very informative for what we're here today, is we all saw that China was stealing emails over the last couple of days because they had phony authentication to lift those emails from Microsoft 365. Here's what's going on in the backdrop beyond what we see with Russia and Ukraine. China is on a mission to obtain the upper hand in the economy. They're seeking to appropriate as much economic information as possible, so when they finally operationalize their quantum computers, they can decrypt it. It's a long-range ploy. So again, best practices in place because the risk is only expanding, and really no small medium enterprise can stand up to this other than to keep themselves out of harm's way.
Can I just quickly,
Please.
one key differentiator I forgot to mention about the two breach scenarios is I mentioned the first one was over $100,000 in damages. The second one had $18,000 in damages. They didn't even have to file a claim because the deductible was larger than the damages. So proactivity does pay off.
Great point. Great point. And I think that's such an important part of the underwriting process, and with a good broker making sure that the cyber hygiene is there. So when something bad happens, it's a much smaller problem. Any questions? Yeah. Oh, are you just giving me a 5-minute? Okay. I thought you were waving to me and being very kind. Okay, are there any questions right now? Otherwise, we're going to go to some key takeaways I'd like to have each of our panelists tell us. And if you have any questions among that, please raise your hand. Michelle, what are a couple key takeaways that we should walk out here with?
And I mean, I think we've all hit on it a little bit, is just you're never placing a single policy at a time. You have to take the blinders off and understand what's going on in the peripheral vision with other policies. All of your property casualty policies, your financial lines policies, to understand the language that's in there, how they all work together, don't work together. Doing that type of work and having those discussions pays off tremendously in the long run. And it will enable you to get better terms and conditions. You create better relationships with the carriers. The carriers aren't the bad guys, I have to be honest, they're really not. And there's really not intention from carriers to pull back. But it's always the fear when you're underwriting, it's the fear of the unknown. So transparency isn't a bad thing. It actually will help you in the long run, I feel, with language and how you're structuring and how these different policies and pieces work together.
Awesome. Thanks. Kevin and Chuck, you guys get 45 seconds each. Tell us a good takeaway or two.
Well, I like what you were saying about proactivity, and I think kind of tying in what Chuck said, since I've already talked about being proactive technically, is tying in the teams together. I know, like I've heard from our insurance companies and some legal counsel that it's not good for us to have a security team integrated with our IT teams and doing remediation. There could be a conflict of interest, but I can tell you that we restored the whole system within 24 hours, and we had a similar amount of damage as the $100,000 scenario. So I might challenge some of that. I know there's laws and there's boundaries there. I respect that, but there might be some efficiencies to be gained to like build your insurance teams and your security teams and your IT teams really tight knit together.
Spot on. Chuck, what would you tell us?
Oh, like I was discussing earlier, build your teams of professionals and put all your heads together to create the plans, because you need to have a plan for when you get attacked to minimize the damage for when that attack takes place. I mean, that's the most important thing I can say to the group here.
Fantastic. Bruce, you finish it up, a couple of takeaways.
Follow what the team said and then you won't have to worry about this war and nation state exclusion. It's here to stay. The geopolitical landscape is becoming increasingly threatening. Follow their advice and hopefully sidestep the problem. Much simpler terms, brush your teeth carefully and maybe you don't have to get a root canal.
Always great advice. And my final takeaway will be stop writing exhibits. Tell your clients, tell the people you work with that this information is so critical, important, yet very damaging if it gets in the hands of the wrong people. And the wrong people will try to get that information, and they will in discovery. So try to make it that the information either doesn't exist or it's clearly protected because it was in connection with assisting counsel in providing legal advice. And you can really structure it that way. It can be done. Any final questions before we wrap up? Well, I want to thank my amazing panel. Thank you all so much.